Shae Russell from mining.com.au, and joining me back for our first chat for 2025 is Mr. Data Dan. Data Dan, how are you? It's been too long between takes.
It's been too long, Shay. We had Christmas. Probably carrying 1 or 2 Christmas kilos, but now that we're back in the proverbial flow, I should say, it's fantastic to be on deck again and to be covering all things statistics. It's been a lot going on already. So 2025, let's get into it.
Well, here's the thing. You say covering all things statistics, and we're going to kick off with talking about the Trump inauguration. We are mere days away from Trump being sworn in as being, is he going to be the 46th president? I might be caught out. I might have to Google that while you're talking.
No, I think he's 47 because he was 45. Or if you remember the US actor, was it Jesse Smollett who made up that he was beaten up in Chicago and his story fell apart, and he was asked why he did it, and he blamed Donald Trump.
Well,
So it's interesting. That's I mean, weirdly, for every controversy Mr. Trump's had, it seems to have just made his legacy grow.
something we'll have to dissect when we've got more time, but let's talk about the policies that are coming in with a Trump presidency. Now, I was talking about in a morning meeting early today that the price of lumber in the US is up 7%, and it's had one hell of a ride for January, largely reacting to potential tariffs Trump may implement on Canadian softwood coming into the country. Dan, I don't even know where to start breaking down this macro environment the US finds themselves in. Tell me, what is season 25 going to look like for the US?
Well, so there's a couple of things, and we will start talking statistics. So the US GDP is significant, like it's the thick end of heading towards $30 trillion. You would expect the GDP growth to remain elevated, possibly above trend. I'd say, if we're to trust Treasury, that's like kind of, a +3 in front of it. So the rest of the Western world, particularly the mature Western world and the G7, can only just look at that and salivate. But the underlying problems are they've had an inflation print which was elevated, but the underlying pressure is easing. It is hard to see how tariffs can further ease inflation. So that's a very difficult concept to digest. I mean, I think we were talking off air, that you've got this return to the strongman idea of 1980s economic policy, except the strongmen are championing policies popular and protected economies. So this communist flavor, which is kind of bizarre for avowed capitalists. But anyway, if you're to look at it, to break it down to pure numbers, you would suspect, given the pro-business, low-tax rhetoric, that sentiment alone would continue to elevate the US economy with a +3 quarter on quarter. That's +3% quarter on quarter growth. The tariff, it remains to be seen whether that's actually a bargaining tactic. Inflation is heading in the right path, but again, that overnight cash rate at sub 5%, if that was to come down further, that would be far more positive for markets than the idea of just sentiment alone. So then you add all this in together, the United States government itself still has, a debt ceiling well north of $20 trillion. That is an extraordinary amount of money. I mean, I remember we used to do all sorts of, funky size and scope, saying if you put the dollar notes end on end, it would travel to the moon. That's how much money $20 trillion is. But by and large, if you were to unpack all of that, that debt is a millstone. Now, Republicans like to talk about efficiency in government and reducing government debt, but when it comes to debt ceilings, which is a vagary of the Congress there where they actually have to approve the debt ceiling, that's a problem. That money is a big problem. They might have some relief coming in the form of a ceasefire in Israel. Whether or not Mr. Trump can engineer an outcome in Eastern Europe remains to be seen. But those things alone, so debt, inflation, and a rampant US dollar are really what's going to be the themes going into the first quarter of 2025. Now, that rampant US dollar, tough for countries facing an inflation issue of their own, but very good at the same time for the exporters, particularly here in Australia, which are linked to commodities. So there's a positive in all this. I mean, Australian miners, in a lot of cases, they sell in USD, their costs are incurred in AUD. So there is an upside there.
There is an extremely good upside for a strong US dollar for our miners, but a strong US dollar and a weak AUD sucks for consumers because it actually doubles down on our inflationary pressures. But I want to sort of skip forward to the Aussie employment data came out. I think it was earlier in the week. I'd love to say what day I know, but I just know it came
It was
out.
today,
Oh, it was
actually.
today. Oh, good. I'm so good at my job.
Third Thursday of every month is the Australian employment data. A bit of a lottery because it is actually a household survey.
Mm.
And so it tends to get held up as this great report, but it's very hard to go into the detail of it. The better employment report is the quarterly report, which goes into industry, and you can actually really pull out a lot of great trends there. But again, doing that on a monthly basis would probably be a bit too resource intensive for the Australian Bureau of Statistics. But the takeout, what it's 4% unemployment, a host of full-time jobs still coming on stream. So that's obviously a big positive. But where are they coming on? They seem to be coming on in areas of critical need, so health, government-related work tends to be driving the outcome. The private sector, that's really where the tail of the Australian economy is at the moment. The private sector, so again, the most profitable and the best performing sector is the resources sector within the private sector. But again, it's doing a lot of heavy lifting for companies that are being simply crushed by pricing pressure, particularly around input costs, and that's mainly labour and of course energy. Now, the strange takeout is the biggest casualty so far is the fact that the humble coffee barista is really getting hammered at the moment. In fact, their insolvency rates up towards 2,500 people. This is 2,500 businesses, I should say, that have either declared that they can no longer trade. So that came out from ASIC only yesterday. So there's a lot of problems for what I would call metropolitan East Coast Australia. Perth remains strong. Queensland, of course, tied to the met coal sector. They're again tied into Japan, whose biggest boom industry currently is tourism, and those tourists are coming from where? Here. The yen against the Aussie dollar is the only game in town. So that's been a strange uh, number to come through, that Japanese tourism, inbound tourism from Australia is very, very strong. So that's again a flip from the 1980s. It used to be Japanese tourists coming to Australia to play on the golf courses here because there were so many. Now you've got Australians going in large numbers up to Japan to ski. So there we are. 1980s, what a decade.
Do you know, I had no idea that this was the year it was going to take me back. I didn't Back to the Future promises hoverboards, and as you said, we've gone back to strongmen with strongmen policies. Communism enters in. It's funny you mentioned that because my entire social media feed is full of my friends currently skiing in Japan. Very, very jealous that they're out there. Now, a late in life discovery of mine is stockpiles of metals around the world. I'm not going to lie, I didn't dream of this as a little girl, but not long before I turned 40, I got really into metal stockpiles at the London Metals Exchange and also the Shanghai Futures Exchange, or affectionately called the SHFE. When does that data drop? Because I am particularly interested in what's happening with gold, and also I do love some base metals. What's happening with copper?
So Sheffy is probably the leading indicator. And how's this? Those inventory data points come out weekly. So you can actually get a read on the amount of money, the amount of base metal, precious metal being held, even crude oil being held in stockpiles and warehouses in Shanghai. So that data comes out tomorrow. Big play, of course, is gold. Has been very, very prominent in that part of the world, but base metals and particularly aluminium remains to be a bit of a star material. So that comes out tomorrow. So we'll get that around 4 p.m. AEDT time. So that's Australian Eastern Daylight Savings Time. But we're starting to profile that here on mining.com.au. So look out for that. That's a table which we are producing, and we'll have some history. So folks who subscribe or basically view our content can see what's happening in the Shanghai ports.
Very exciting. It's a Christmas present for me, just a little bit late. Listen, Dan, we're going to have to wrap up in a minute, but we're going into next week. This time next week, we will have a new president in the US. More of the same, though, I believe. But what data is dropping next week that in particular you're looking to see?
Well, again, we're starting to head to the fourth week with it, so it's there's not really the only really big thing which we're looking at the moment is probably some of the weekly consumer confidence data. We've also got some credit aggregate data coming out here in Australia, as well as some construction work done. So they're some of the ABS data points which are currently assessing. So I think the construction data is going to be some of the prints there are going to be very interesting because the engineering data dropped earlier this week, and that gives you, for example, a value of what's being built around the country, and it's around $35 billion of engineering activity in the September quarter, whether that flows through, of course, the fourth and indeed the first quarter of this year. So that's what we're looking at coming up.
See, I was in wrap up mode. Now I'm not. Engineering data. I actually do love sort of like a peek behind the curtain of what's in the pipeline. And engineering data very much gives you that information. Tell me, where is this engineering activity happening? Is it in the mining sector? Is it in construction?
It's basically Australia's got, there's a lot of debt the federal government's taken on in the last decade, and uh, debt has also, while politicians say it's not a dirty word, it can also be an incredibly tough word if it becomes a problem. So a lot of that is mainly, government infrastructure, bridges, ports, highway
Mm.
construction. The Bruce Highway here in Queensland, for example, is a death trap, and so the fatality rate alone along this highway has necessitated the federal government to spruik that as an election commitment. So look for those data points to become again quite important going into this election cycle, because that is
Mm.
actually what Australia's domestic build, its big build, which is happening, of course, in Victoria. Queensland has a 5-year program of around $50 billion, as according to state treasury data. Plus, they have to work out how to build a myriad of stadia for an Olympics. They probably now ruining they wish they'd ever got. So it's really basically Australia's got three clustered populations on the east coast, and then of course Western Australia, and it's that build connecting the cities which is actually dominating a lot of the big spend at the moment, particularly around construction and indeed engineering.
Listen, Donna Dan, as usual, I could let this run over. Love talking to you, but you will be back in the hot seat next week with some new spreadsheets in front of you to chat about. I can rely on you to have some spreadsheets open. Listen, Dan, thank you so much for being here. This was great. We'll speak soon.
All right, thanks, Shae. Cheers.